the Trillion Trees podcast hosted by Saad Al-Lawala. Join the movement. 1 trillion trees by 2030. Tune in for inspiring stories, groundbreaking ideas, and real solutions to tackle climate change. Listen to it. Watch every Saturday, 4 p.m. Make an impact now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Trillion Tree podcast. This podcast today, we are joined by a very special guest. I got to listen to what she had to say in Davos this year at the Climate Scale Up events. She's doing a market that people don't really think about. And in a very, I wouldn't say it's a social enterprise, but in a very smart manner that I want to hear more about it from her. It's called Tessie. Today we have Susan with us, Susan Hunt, who is an extremely learned and educated human being. We had a discussion earlier a few weeks ago, and so many things that I got to learn from her. And that is the target for today's podcast as well, that we get to learn about Susan one-on-one, about how she started off and what she's doing now, and how does she see the world grow in the climate market very soon. Susan, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's an honor to have you on the podcast, and thank you so much for giving your time once again.
It's great to be here, and it's an honor to be asked. So I'm glad we get a chance to talk today and share more about what's happening in the world of climate resilience.
Yes, with the world of climate resilience, focus on that. I'd really like to start off with your journey, with your personal journey. Where did you start off? What about your education? And then how did you actually get into sustainability and technology?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest part of the United States in Washington State, but I moved to the East Coast for college and really never moved back. And in the beginning, it was sort of a traditional job. I was a management consultant out of undergrad, although working in health. And I think the through line that I've seen in my career is I always wanted to work in business, but in businesses that were making the world a better place. So I've been in healthcare, I've been in journalism, and now climate. And so after business school up at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, I got involved in technology, and I've been in technology ever since. I spent about 9 years as a senior executive at the New York Times company. I started on the digital side, and then ended up over both print and digital, and then eventually the GM of one of our digital businesses. But I got interested in sustainability more personally. When my son was born, he was very allergic to a number of foods, and in trying to research what was in the foods we were giving him, it wouldn't often be the things he was allergic to, but it would say something about the potential health impacts or environmental impacts of that food. And this was sort of pre-Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth, when not a lot of us knew what was going on with climate. It was sort of a realm of the scientists more than the humans. Besides scientists. And so I just started reading more and more and getting more and more interested in environmental health in particular, and sort of the impact that the environment has on human health. And I started blogging about it, and actually ended up back in grad school for sustainable design because it was the closest thing I could find to like sustainable living. And so I went back to the Boston Architectural College, and that's where I did a graduate certificate in sustainable design. And it's where I got the idea for my second startup, which was really, at the time, the concept was for houses, we had a system called the LEED system for green building. And I was like, well, why isn't there a system for people to do the things they could do in their life to be more sustainable? And so I kind of built that gamified system with a co-founder and a team. And that's the business that became WeSpire. We became the largest platform for sustainability education and engagement for global companies. And then we started adding other aspects of ESG, social impact, diversity, equity, and inclusion, well-being, and we're really the first one-stop shop for ESG engagement in the world, which we were really, really proud of. And we worked with some of the biggest, best companies in the world, and who probably collectively across them had millions of employees. So we had hundreds of thousands of people participate in our programs. and eventually exited to a larger social technology company. And that is where I decided to continue being interested in an aspect of climate resilience I'd encountered. So while running WeSpire, one of our programs were employee assistance programs, and we would run those for people after we did it in COVID, but sometimes it was after disasters. And when it was after disasters, it was often to help people get access to money to repair their home. And what happens after a disaster is that people often find that their insurance, they may not have insurance, or the insurance they have may not cover the specific damage because of the kind of storm it was, particularly flooding and hurricanes in the US. Or there was a gap between what it was cost and what they were insured for that damage. But the worst was that sometimes people put deposits down, and bad actors, contractors show up, take a deposit, and then never come back. And so I felt like there was this thing going on after disasters where the system just wasn't serving people well, and thought maybe there was something I could do about that. And so that's where Tessie was born. So that's, in a nutshell, in a quick 5 minutes, a long 25-year career.
Yeah. And it's really inspiring to see that all the different schools you went to for different reasons. And from what you say is that you hadn't planned to go to the Boston School of Architecture, but you did end up doing something that is very related to architecture now. Maybe not directly, but
no, absolutely.
yeah. No, my next question actually was that what did you see in the system that was broken? But you pretty much answered that yourself.
I jumped there.
Yeah. When we talk about Tessie in general and the kind of individuals or the kind of people you see actually it helping, who would you describe that to be?
Yeah, so I think the best way to think about it is who is the user and who is the customer. So the user is the homeowner. They are the one whose home has been damaged, and what they're able to do through Tessie is put their address in, and we will create a damage estimate and report for them. But our customer is really the service provider, because today the service providers, in our opinion, don't have the information that they need to be able to efficiently and effectively service the homeowners, particularly those homeowners who don't have insurance, which in the US in flooding and hurricanes, or they may have insurance, but the insurance isn't fully covering what needs to get done. And in the statistics in flooding and hurricanes is shocking. It's over 90% of homeowners don't have the ability to get their homes fixed through traditional insurance coverage. And so what we're helping the homeowner do is access the funding that they need. And then by knowing what needs to be done and what access to funding a person has, we're better able to triage work to providers and to make it more efficient for those providers to help these homeowners by knowing that they can take a financial risk because these folks can pay them, knowing what needs to be done before they go on site, making sure that, when they take the job, they're guaranteed to get it and do it. Whereas right now they might go and provide a bid and not get the work. And so it just changes how the system works. And by changing how the system works, it'll be faster for sure. It'll keep bad actors out of the system, the people who take advantage of homeowners, because it's trusted network. I liken it in that sense to, I would still never get in a car with a stranger, but I do it all the time in ride sharing, because they've created a trust-based system where it's safe for me to get in a car with a person I don't know, whereas I wouldn't do that under normal circumstances, like showing up at the airport and some dude with a card saying, here,
Airbnb,
pick me up.
Going to someone's house.
Yeah, kind of thing. And so creating that trust-based system is really valuable, and it can help to address some of the inefficiencies. But the way we were able to do this is that the dramatic innovations in geospatial data, phone-based visual data, and AI give us the ability to have a very solid estimate of the work that needs to be done and how much it's going to cost. And with that estimate, we're then able to better provide the knowledge of what funding a person is going to need to be able to do this. And then if they don't have access to any funding, we will triage the work to volunteers, and we'll have volunteer forces on the platform to help those who don't have funding. But the that mystery to the homeowner of they don't even know what needs to get done and how much it should cost. The funders, today would send somebody manually to tell you that, whether that's government funder or an insurance funder, and then tell you what's covered and not covered. And we can just do that all through AI now. And that makes the whole process significantly cheaper and easier for people. And we think we'll provide the data to mobilize more workers into the platform. And we aim to help with that, to help mobilize, more folks by being able to say, hey, within 24 hours of disaster, 100,000 homes have been affected. This many are destroyed. This many have severe damage, moderate damage, minor damage. Here's what it's going to take to get this area fixed. And therefore, the resources can be mobilized, because our theory is that the capital exists. It's just spread out, dispersed, and hard to access. The labor exists. It's just dispersed, spread out, and hard to access. And so if you can better orchestrate the work to be done with the capital and the labor, you're going to create a more efficient market.
That is absolutely true. And so many things that can happen that are now easy with the AI and with the technology that we have. It's surprising that technologies like softwares or products like these weren't available earlier. I think up to some extent, I'm forgetting the name of this service, but where you could hire someone to come and fix stuff in your house.
So there's, I was actually on the original advisory board for the company that became TaskRabbit.
Yes.
And then there's Angie, and then there's Thumbtack, and there's all these others. But that process, what it is essentially a good way to rate and review, in the case of Angie, what used to be Angie's List providers. And, and then you could say, here's the work to be done. And then it would show you who would be available. But there's just so much work you have to do. And that person still often needs to provide an estimate. They still need to come and see it, or you may need to get 3 bids, or you may need to do this. And so I think by knowing as a homeowner the general cost of what, most likely the damage is going to be, especially after a disaster where it's really hard to get anybody to show up. And so you're therefore tempted to work with the person who knocks on your door, drives by, or, things like that. This just makes it 1,000 times easier to understand the scope of work, understand the jobs to be done, and then will match workers to you. You always have the ability to say, no, I'd prefer a different one. Or, same thing with the providers. They'll have the ability to turn down a job if it's not a good fit for them. But it takes a lot of the legwork out of it for the homeowner. And right now, the homeowner is drowning in paper and legwork and phone calls and things like that. And so our goal is that you can get all of this done just through your phone and saying yes to, just like when you pick up and you can see that there's 8 different ways, to get to the airport. Do you want an XL car? Do you want a comfort car? Do you want to, this? But it's constrained the decisions. It's not a matter of, am I going to get a car or not? And I'm not going to want to interview every driver before I get a ride. The thing that's going to matter is, what do I want to spend?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. And I think that's true to so many more systematical changes that we need to see at scale everywhere. Not just the US. If you look at it technology-wise, it's pretty behind globally. Whether that's with civic issues or even with banking banking solutions. I might actually have more features on my banking apps in Pakistan than in the US. So, and even
That's
though
very true.
that is
It's
so,
funny you should say that, but I think you know, my experience traveling internationally is that many countries leapt over sort of a wave of technology that the US was ahead in.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
then, but then our regulatory frameworks made it harder for some of those industries to innovate as fast as um, others who didn't have solutions. And so having something that was even available, was solving huge problems. That's true. Like I've spent a decent amount of time in Vietnam, and Vietnam didn't have a great landline infrastructure for phones, and therefore they just skipped that generation of innovation and went to mobile.
Yeah.
Whereas I used to work at a telco company for a short period of time as an intern in business school. But, when you have to innovate and yet maintain an existing legacy infrastructure, that gets really expensive and really hard.
No denying that. Absolutely. And I would still say US is still the hottest startup market, or still the biggest financial hub in the world because of that specific, that old, not old, but like that working infrastructure existing and then we building on top of that. So it's lovely to see businesses like Tessie.
Yeah, but I do think that innovation goes faster
Yeah.
sometimes externally, especially in finance.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about climate, most of people, whenever they think about climate, they focus on mitigation. But you guys are actually taking a different approach of resilience and adaptation. Why is adaptation still under discussed? Why do you think that?
Under discussed in your mind?
I think
Yeah.
adaptation,
I
yeah.
think I think there's a legacy reason, and then I think there's some factors today. So the legacy reason that often is cited is I think there was a concern expressed by many in the policy environment and even in the innovation environment that giving up on mitigation, investing in adaptation resilience was essentially admitting we'd failed in mitigation, and people wanted to continue to fight to hold the line, and so wanted to put the majority of their investment funds or their policy efforts or their nonprofit efforts into mitigation. And I think, sadly, the reality that we're going to blow past 1.5 Cs and just what we're seeing on the ground in terms of disasters being one of the things cited, and I would put in disasters things like extreme heat and crop failure and, all of this. People are just realizing that even if we do get ourselves back on track, or when we get ourselves back on track, there's still a lot of devastation to come in the interim. And that therefore, the business case for adaptation and resilience became more clear, and people can argue about the numbers, but most people's, what I would call experts, show that there's a huge return on investment for every dollar that is put into adaptation and resilience in terms of destruction and damage and all of that avoided.
Exactly.
The challenge is who pays for it. And I think that is the other reason that adaptation and resilience initiatives and attention and funding struggles. If you think about what has to be taken into account, you've got the destructive forces on nature, whether that's beaches eroding or soils becoming more salinated, or, so you've got this whole nature impact that, of course, disproportionately hits developing nations who don't have funding to do the work that is needed or sources of funds to do it, they aren't the cause of the problem, relatively speaking, when you look at the impact that large nations and more developed nations have had. And so when you look at particularly the impact on nature and what climate change is going to do to nature and natural systems, this question of who pays for animals, who pays for beaches, who pays for, cooling our oceans, who pays for cleaning up all the frickin' sargassum. I just saw that front row seat in the Caribbean. It's brutal. Who pays for this? And I think the frameworks that people are trying to establish is that people who are the largest polluters should be the ones who are paying for resilience. But that requires large polluters to say, sure, we're going to cough up funds to make available. So that's already challenging. And one of the reasons why I think we're behind in adaptation and resilience, besides the sort of psychological it's giving up. But I think the other area is that resilience requires system level changes for systems that require a lot of people to change how they do things, and change is really hard, in entire industries. So just look at resilience in housing, and let's just look at resilience in housing in the US. So to get everyone in the United States to just even build to a more resilient housing standard, you have to tackle building codes. Yeah. Where are building codes managed in the United States? That's not something that's federal. That's not something that's state. That is, building codes are literally managed and governed by every single town differently in the US.
Really? There's no standard framework for everyone?
No. Every single town has a different building code. I know.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
So if you want to build more, if you want to get US housing stock to be more resilient, we have a standards body that's called IBHS that has created more resilient building standards. But you have to get every single town to agree to change their framework to more resilient building standards. And the argument has been, well, that costs more. And so then towns who want to make it more attractive for people to build in their town versus the next town don't want to put regulations in place that make it more expensive to be in their town, because then they're worried about losing business to the town next door. And so nothing happens, and so it is changing here and there, but it's a really, really complicated, you don't just say in the US, oh, we're going to make more resilient building codes. You literally have to get every single town to agree to change their building codes.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
And so you run into these kinds of challenges of who's going to pay for it. But even if you could figure out who's going to pay for it, how you drive change at the municipal level, town level, county level, let alone state and federal level at the US, is really, really, really complicated. And so there's really smart people working on it. I would say the group that has an outsized influence in the US around resilience would be two different bodies. One would be insurers, whether that's, private insurers or public insurers like the last resort plans. Those groups can have pretty significant influence. And then in the US, we've often driven change through a federal government. And so were we to have a federal government who wanted to focus more on resilience, that is a place where, for example, totally different sector, when the federal government decided that they wanted the states to change the drinking age in the US from 18 to 21, or 19 to 21, whatever it was in various states. What they just said is, you can keep your drinking age at 18, but then we will not put money into federal highway funds. kind of thing. And so the federal government can choose sometimes to get a wholesale state policy change through by linking it to federal funding, you know. And so there were efforts in the previous administration to create more market mechanisms for resilience. Unfortunately, many of those funds have been suspended. Not all of them have been revoked, but suspended pending review. And so we will see. But, you know, there's some crazy things in the US, like the federal government really played the backstop for municipal infrastructure damage after disasters, which didn't create a lot of incentive for municipalities to insure their infrastructure. That might change. That might not be a bad thing. But where does a town suddenly come up with money to pay for insurance for municipal infrastructure? Oh, great. Now we have to raise taxes. Well, guess how that goes over in the US? You know, we were founded as a nation against taxes. So it's so anyway, these are very complicated systems that need fixing to make these. So there's no like wave a magic wand, silver bullet for resilience. What I will say is that insurance isn't looking at this as a political issue. This is an economic survival issue for insurers, and insurers are, you know, voting with their dollars for states that are taking it seriously versus not, for states that are giving them the ability to do what they need to do or not, to keep people insured. And I think the insurability crisis, which is ultimately going to tie into a housing crisis around affordability and mortgages, is going to be something that's going to force some interesting bedfellows to come together and sort this out. And I think there is good work being done on it. And I am certainly part of, you know, a whole group of entrepreneurs that is relatively new to this space and seeing a lot more support and interest in resilient solutions.
That support is coming, you're saying, that would be from government or insurance?
No, it's coming more from the private sector. It's coming from venture funds. It's coming from insurers. It's coming from states. You know, a few spots where it's federal, but federal attention is elsewhere right now.
Yeah, elsewhere. So just I mean, I think we don't have much time left, but I do have a few questions I just want to quickly ask, and then
absolutely
get the most out of this conversation. We've talked a lot about how the government operates and how policy works right now in this sector, and what is required for change. If we talk about because I have one general question, is that you have worked a lot with large organizations over the span of your large enterprise. I mean, you worked 14 years with your last company, and then in this time you've just started again. You've created a new baby. Now you're again in the market and you're raising it again. That's how we treat companies. I mean, we're taught to treat companies in Pakistan. Oh, you just made a baby now. Now take care of it. You have to do every single thing.
Exactly.
So if we really think about large organizations, that if we just think about the Fortune 500s, they control more capital than most of the countries globally. Most of them. I mean, if you remove the top 10,
yes.
What is their focus on their investments, like strategy wise, which I would ask for the next 10 to 15 years, in your opinion? Because the climate affects them as well, whether they want to be super highly profitable or not. They do see that things are changing, and whether that's infrastructure wise, or capital market wise, or even let's say emerging capital markets wise, things have to be climate resilient. What do you think that would be a focus from a Fortune 500 point of view?
Yeah. So and again, I do have a front row seat to how big companies are thinking through a number of different engagements with chief sustainability officers, as well as just CEOs of tech companies and things like that. Right now, climate has taken a little bit of a backseat to geopolitical issues and AI. Every company is having to figure out how do we navigate the changing world order and what's happening politically, not just in the US, but around the world. How are we taking advantage of managing the risks associated with the greatest technological opportunity / disruption, certainly in my lifetime, as big, if not bigger than the internet itself. And then so climate is on everyone's agenda. It just isn't right now in the top two. And that is a problem for hitting goals that we need to hit to ensure we maintain a global temperature that's, thrivable for everyone. And so it's not that they've stopped working on it. I do want to be clear. I think there is this misconception that corporates are backing off from their climate commitments. Perhaps some of the, what I'm going to call airy-fairy commitments that they had no chance of hitting anyway. What I think is actually getting down to is much more tactical brass tacks executionally and internally. But I think the reasoning for doing it has changed, and some of that is good and some of that is problematic. So the reasoning is going much more towards the physical risk assessments when they're looking at what their physical risks are to their supply chain and to their products, markets, infrastructure, ability to operate, and things like that. They are having to look at climate from the lens of how do I manage the physical risk associated with it. And a lot had understood what am I doing to create, as one of many players on this planet, the impact that's causing everything to destabilize, and how do I therefore reduce the destabilizing impact I'm having. And they still are working on their mitigation strategies, but they're all having to deal with their physical risk strategies as well now in a world that isn't getting mitigated. And so you're seeing everything from one of the world's leading chocolate companies deciding to remove cocoa from its products, or some of its products, which is sort of like, whoa, to others that are really reshoring certain work so that they don't have as much exposure to supply chain risks, to others that are, thinking completely differently about where they locate operations and things like that. So there's sort of a shift in that sense. I think the other is how they're collaborating has had to change. And some of that is because of the geopolitical pressure that some are getting to not collaborate at an industry level on these things. So you've seen a number of the climate groups have members pull out, from these sort of collaborative efforts. And on the other hand, you're seeing other efforts where people are recognizing that we don't really have an ability to solve this as an individual. So we need to put something together to try and create, more alignment, more standards.
Could you name like a consortium of organizations?
Yeah. So for example, there were all these standards bodies that were emerging in all these different frameworks and protocols and all of this. And I think people kind of corporates said, stop the madness and let's put these things together. And so you're seeing ISSB and TCFD and all of these others starting to come together to coalesce around a single framework for governing how they're going to do things, and frameworks. And so I think you're seeing consolidation in some areas that's good. And then you're seeing some collaborations fall apart, that's not obviously as good. But I think the general attitude of most chief sustainability officers is perhaps there had been way too much emphasis over the last 3 years on measurement and reporting and not enough on impact and action. And the de-emphasizing of impact and reporting somewhat, I would still argue there's more emphasis on this than there was 10 years ago. But, the de-emphasis, if that is still, getting moved into creating more action, that may not be a bad thing. It just, the question is, since corporations since US based corporations have very specifically chosen not to talk about what they're doing, because that becomes a target for, legal action from certain states and, ire from certain political leaders, they've chosen to become quiet about it. And that's a bummer, because this is one of those weird areas where corporations talking about what they're doing is actually really good for innovation, because they can learn from each other, because this isn't something that you're competing on. I had the experience of having clients in the exact same industry who would collaborate on things like getting renewable energy into their local grid, because if they both demanded it, their utility was more likely to do it than if they didn't team up on it. And so these are pre-competitive collaborations that can change systems when industries work together, like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition or some of the others. Yeah. I've seen really interesting innovations in aggregated virtual purchase power agreements, where corporations are coming together to catalyze the creation of renewable energy. And and because no one on their own could go get that to happen. But if they could team up with, 4 or 5 organizations, they could make it happen. And so I think this is an area where teaming up with people can have more impact than trying to do it alone. And so when people stop talking about it as much externally, it may reduce the chance of people hearing about this really cool thing that one company is doing and then 10 other companies choosing to do it.
Yeah. Just to, again, one important question that I think I personally believe that shouldn't be left out. Before I let you go, I really wanted to ask you that if let's say we're looking at the next 10 years, what technologies do you believe, because you've been in Boston, you've been around the MIT circle, you're connected in that, you see technology firsthand. Most technologies that we see are coming out of the US. Most innovations, in whether that's in climate or not in climate. But what technologies do you believe that in the climate resilience space for the next 10 years would be the most important, and that keeps you optimistic?
Yeah. So the first is the energy transition in general keeps me optimistic. The data still is mind-blowing about how that is changing. And there's lots of different reasons it's changing, but most new energy coming onto the grid is clean energy. And what is interesting to look at is there's a lot of anti-AI around energy, but the reality I see is that the big energy users in AI, i.e. the Magnificent Seven, are making some of the most catalytic investments in new energy technologies, whether that's Commonwealth fusion or other forms of SMR or Microsoft working with Indigo for huge CDR removals and things like that. And so those tech companies are in fact making very big investments and advanced market commitments in new forms of low impact energy, low carbon impact energy sources and CDR. And so that's exciting. Jigar Shah, who ran the loan office and is very well respected in the energy space, gave a stat on a call I was on that 150 gigs of new power are going to have to come on the grid. And the only way to do that, because there isn't enough fossil that could be developed in that time, is to rely on new renewables, and I would include nuclear in renewables. But I would also look at Pakistan, for example, and when the grid becomes less reliable, which in many places because of climate, it's going to, and because of, changing technology, it's going to. People need power, they need reliable power, and if the cost of solar is plunging, people start to become their own mini little power plants at the home level, and all of a sudden you look at how much energy is getting created, and that can cause all sorts of issues at the utility scale. But it
Individually.
is fascinating to see that people will do that. And you look at the energy demand. I would tell you that, a conversation that is unfortunate has occurred over the last few weeks is those folks, at least in the short term, who are driving electric vehicles, and are not facing huge price raises at the pump. We may ultimately end up feeling it in electric rates if your grid is powered by natural gas and not as much renewables. But, in a world of energy volatility due to 20% of the world's oil supply all of a sudden being unable to travel, renewables become again another thing. So that whole transition keeps me optimistic. There are two others that I think are really, really interesting. And one is the increasing opportunities to rid ourselves of toxic plastics that end up in waste streams. I think some of the most exciting innovations, whether it's Knopfler from the Earthshot Prize, but these bio-based packaging kind of things, and this move to more circular packaging and getting ourselves rid of the waste and the toxins that are associated with that packaging. I think there's a lot of really interesting momentum on that and a lot of really interesting companies emerging around that all over the world, but here as well. And then the last thing that I just, we see benefiting, but I think has so many applications in climate is the plunging cost of visual satellite data and geospatial data, and we're using it obviously to help get homes fixed after disasters, but there's people using it to spot wildfires and get them put out before they become really devastating. There's people using it to understand where illegal logging is taking place, and being able to put a stop to, the devastation of lands. There's, so the application of AI into climate solutions is obviously near and dear to my heart. And there's just some really cool stuff happening on that front.
No, one question I was actually writing down where I felt like it might distract the podcast, and I don't think I should be asking more since we have crossed the time limit. But that was that. How do you see that we use, let's say, in third world countries, like especially in such climate devastation focused countries like Pakistan and Philippines, where so much impact happens every year, and they might not have the capital to really restore themselves, and individually, especially, for decades, people would real lives would get destroyed for decades. So for climate resilient planning and using geospatial data, and how can we use AI with geospatial data for the improvement of infrastructure in individual levels, where someone can just open an app and be like, oh, this is the plot I'm living on. What do you suggest I should do? Here's 1,000 rupees. Charge my API or whatever, and then give me a summary of a solution so I can give it to my contractor and they can get it done. Or someone can find me a contractor. Like that's a very simple, basic solution, but how can it be done? I'm still in a puzzle because I've been thinking about this for the past week, especially looking forward to this podcast and doing more research. It just triggered me more and more that, okay, this is something that's a real problem. And this is not just for people who are living right next to the river or to the flood prone areas, but for everyone, because everything is changing. Especially like my uncle, he has been interested in going into mining. I'm not going to say that it's the best thing in the world, but he also has planted way large number of trees, and he runs the second largest solar panel company. So
As I like to remind everybody that at least at this point in time, if we don't have mining, we don't have solar panels.
Exactly. Right. So yeah. So but for mining, someone told him that you can use geospatial data to actually find out, like do the first analysis for where exactly.
There's some incredible,
Yeah.
I believe one of the companies is called Cobalt, that's doing some really cool things around that, and some others. There's awesome companies emerging in this space for those kinds of solutions and things like that. I was an advisor to a company that's using geospatial data to look at farmland, and they can actually model what's likely to happen on a field based on different practices that would be being applied. So you can see as a farmer which applications of different methods and practices would have the greatest impact on yields. Is this going to have an impact? Is this not going to have an impact? And then you can get actually insurance to sort of manage the impacts. So there's all sorts of interesting applications around this. To the idea that you proposed specifically, that one's obviously near and dear to my heart, because with what we are doing to create work orders when a home has been damaged, we could certainly take the same technology and apply it to give people ideas about what they should do to fix this home. What's very interesting, is the insurers would obviously be starting to look at that and say, this is what you have to do in order to fix the home before we'll insure it. So, you can see that coming on that front. But the other part of it is that it gets back to where's the capital for doing this. Where I think it should be integrated into is the real estate purchasing decisions. How many people are checking a property and a home before they buy? It's the biggest investment you make. And so why don't you look at land and homes through a climate risk lens and understand what you're getting yourself into? Well, there's a very powerful lobby here in the US who hates that, which is the Realtors Association of people who sell properties. And they have actually lobbied very hard to basically exclude that information, so much so that Zillow, who used to include it when you would go look at a property on Zillow, sort of backburnered it and things like that. And so, but there's other countries that are creating rating systems, to tell you the climate risk resilience of a certain place. So it's what you're seeking to do is the information that really should empower individuals. Like everything in climate, there are people who stand to lose when people are empowered with information because they have been making money off of that information asymmetry. I like to believe that the winners will be the people who provide transparent, fair information to individuals to make informed decisions around risk, because I may still choose to buy that home that's in a wildfire area, but I'm going to change how I do the plantings to make sure there's not. And, I'm going to change the roof and I'm going to do these things, but I'm still going to have it be in Malibu because Malibu is gorgeous and looks at the ocean and I want to do this. But I know what I'm getting myself into. I think trying to make money on the backs of people being ignorant about the risks is, borderline unethical.
Absolutely. And I think that is our cue to also end this discussion for now. But I do believe that the more discussions, especially on things that we're not doing, are important and the opportunities that there are. So thank you so much for shedding light on so many different solutions that are possible, that are happening. What you're doing is phenomenal. And I would personally want to thank you again for doing what you're doing at Tessie. I would emphasize more because I want products like Tessie to actually get launched in Pakistan and different countries.
Our goal is to get there someday, for sure.
So before you actually have the capacity to get here, there should be some other business here. So that's the target, that there should be healthy competition in the market. More people can maybe bring up solutions like this, because the next 10 years will just come and cross us like nothing happened. And not everyone can solve every problem. So we need more and more people that actually think about climate resilient solutions as well. And that has been our focus at Trillion Trees as well, to support existing businesses, but also to empower people or to actually motivate people to start businesses in the climate focus market. So again, thank you again for your time, for your effort in the space. Best of luck, and thank you so much for your time for the podcast, especially.
Thanks, Sad. Okay, I got to run to my 11:30, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Nice to see you again.
Likewise. Goodbye.
Bye.